Hi everyone, Suzanne here. I hope you're all well and welcome to Sew Custom. Today's video is going to be the making of this little number. So if you're interested in seeing that, then let's get started.
Starting with the fabric, this is a Ponte. It has stretch in both directions. It has a border with a geometric pattern running vertically, but the bulk of the fabric is in this lovely cream colour. I'm also using just a standard grey acetate for lining the cape. And on to the cutting out. This is my back. I have 2 layers of that border fabric underneath this pattern piece. A little notch just at the top of my slit. And then I have 1 dart in the back, which I'm just marking here, firstly with pins, and now to mark where those pins pierce the fabric with my fabric pen. And I'll finish that off camera. So that's that done. So now just to join the dots. So again, using the same fabric pen. Lots of you have been asking about this pen. It's always listed in the description box. This pattern is self-drafted, and for the cape I followed the instructions laid out in a book I have, which again I shall leave listed below. And now to pin the darts, I'm starting at the centre, making sure my pin pierces both of those dots, in through the line on the bottom and back up through the line on the top. So that's one side done, and of course I've done the same on the other side. And ready to stitch. So no back stitch here, just trying to follow those pen marks the whole way up, and when I get to the centre I'm just curving there rather than sewing directly into that point, pulling my threads at the end. So that's how that looks. So just to tie those threads off and give those darts a bit of a press, which you'll see in a second. But I'm just showing here the layout of that fabric. So that geometric print runs along one side and the plain cream on the other. But that's my darts all nicely pressed. So now this piece is ready for shoulder seams, but before I can do that I need to cut out my front. So I have 1 layer of fabric underneath this pattern piece on the fold, and I have a little notch on the centre front at the neck. I have 2 darts here, and I'm marking them in exactly the same way as I did the back. So firstly with pins, and then replacing those pins with dots, snipping my dart legs, joining up my dots, and pinning up all of those darts. So that's the marking all done, and the pinning all done. And now for stitching. For the bust dart, I'm back stitching at the bottom of the legs, following those pen marks the whole way up, pulling my thread at the end. So that's how that looks. And then for the waist darts, same as the back, I'm making sure at the point of the dart in the centre I'm just curving slightly there with my stitches. So you can see that here. And again I'll just tie off all of those ends off camera. And you see on this piece as well I have that nice border running up one side and then just the plain cream on the other. So that's my darts all nicely pressed. And now this piece is ready for the shoulder seams. So just laying that front piece over the back, lining up the shoulder seams and pinning. My fabric is right sides together and ready to stitch. Back stitching at the start, at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, and back stitching at the end. So that's that done. So I'll finish off that edge and give it a bit of a press off camera, which you can see I've went ahead and done here. Nice and neat. So now that my shoulder seams are joined, I'm ready for my cape. So this is my front cape. My fabric underneath is on the fold. I have 2 notches here, one to indicate the shoulder and one the centre of the neck. So that's that done. And I've cut this piece out in such a way that I have that nice geometric shape along one side. And onto the back, 2 layers of fabric underneath this pattern piece, the same little notch at the shoulder, and just like the front, I've kept that geometric shape on one side only. So that's that done. So now just lining up those back pieces with the front right sides together, making sure I'm lining up those notches and pinning, and ready to stitch. Back stitching at the start at my 1 centimeter seam allowance the whole way down. Back stitching to finish. And now I want to line the flounce, so I'm cutting those same pieces out again. So this front piece, my fabric underneath is on the fold, and I have those same notches. And for the back, same thing again, 2 layers of fabric underneath this one, and that same little shoulder notch. So lining these up in exactly the same way as I did the outer fabric, and ready to stitch. Back stitching to start at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, and back stitching to finish. So off camera, I'll give my outer and my lining a nice press along those seams. So you can see I've went ahead and done that here. And now I'm ready to join these 2 pieces together at that outer circle initially. So just lining those up right sides together and pinning along that outer circle, and ready to stitch. Back stitching at the start at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, and I'm taking this nice and easy the whole way around. I want to make sure that those fabric edges are lined up nicely so I maintain that beautiful curve along the bottom edge. And back stitching to finish. So that's how that looks. So I just need to trim down that seam allowance, and I'm going to do that by folding the fabric at its edge and just snipping out a little triangle. That's how that looks, and I'm going to repeat that process the whole way along that edge, so you can see that here. And all this is going to do is help that fabric to lay nice and flat and give me a nice crisp seam. And to help that further, I'm just going to press right along that lining, making sure that that trim seam allowance in underneath is butted up against the lining, so you can see that here. And ready to understitch. So I'm just stitching here through the lining, through that trim seam allowance in underneath. I'm using a little bit of a longer stitch length, back stitching to start, and back stitching to finish. And just like the trimming before, all this is going to do is to help that lining fabric stay nicely tucked away in underneath. So that's how that looks, and once it's had a good press, this is how it looks overall. Super neat and tidy. Love this. So now to finish off that centre back. So I'm just laying my lining fabric right sides together with my outer fabric along that centre back seam, pinning, and ready to stitch. So just like before, at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, back stitching at the start and back stitching at the end. So that's how that looks. So now I'm ready to understitch this piece as well. So I've pressed that seam allowance towards the lining, and I'm stitching here through the lining and that seam allowance just about 1 millimeter or so away from that outer fabric. Back stitching to start, using that same longer stitch length, which will be listed in the description box below, and back stitching to finish. So that's how that looks. And you can see here I finished stitching about an inch up from that corner just because it's impossible to stitch the whole way up. So this is how the whole cape looks so far. So I'm super pleased with how this has turned out. So I have one last thing to do to the cape before I can attach it to the dress. And that is just to tack together the lining and the outer fabric around the neck. So I've just lined up those shoulder seams, the centre front and the centre back, pinned and ready to stitch. So I'm using a little bit of a longer stitch length here. I'm stitching within my seam allowance. And as I say, just tacking these two pieces together. This will just make sure that these two pieces of fabric aren't moving around when I'm trying to stitch them onto the dress. So that's how that looks. So that's my cape fully prepped and ready to be joined to the dress. So I have that lining all attached, all nicely understitched, and it's had a really good press. So now just laying it over the top of the dress, lining up those centre front notches, lining up the shoulders and lining up the centre backs, pinning and ready to stitch. And again I'm stitching here within my seam allowance. I'm just tacking my cape on for now, and when I put the facing in later on I'll sew it all in permanently, so these stitch lines will be hidden. Back stitching at the start and the end. So that's how that looks. So now that my cape is all attached, I'm ready to add my facing. So this is my front facing, my fabric underneath is on the fold, and I have one little notch at the centre front at the neck, and onto the back, 2 layers of that fabric underneath this pattern piece. And now to join these two pieces together at the shoulder. So just laying my front over my back, right sides together, and pinning those shoulder seams. And stitching here at my 1 centimetre seam allowance, back stitching at the start and the end. So that's how that looks. So I'll finish off those edges and give that a little bit of a press off camera, which you can see I've went ahead and done here. And while I was at the overlocker, I just ran those lower edges through it just to tidy them up. And now that that's done, this piece is ready to be added to the dress. So I'm just lining that facing up with the neckline, making sure my notches are lined up, my shoulder seams lined up, and pinning, and ready to stitch. And stitching here this time at my 1 centimetre seam allowance, back stitching at the start, taking it nice and gentle. I want this curve to be super smooth, and back stitching to finish. So that's how that looks. So I just need to trim down that seam allowance, just in the same way as I did the cape earlier. So I'm just folding the fabric along its edge and snipping out a little triangle, and I'll finish the rest of that off camera. So you can see that here. And now, just like the cape before, I want to understitch. So I've just pressed the facing away from the dress, making sure that that trimmed seam allowance is butted up against the facing, and stitching here directly through both, just about 1 millimetre or 2 away from the seam you've just seen me sew. Using that same little bit of a longer stitch length, back stitching to start and back stitching to finish. So that's that done. So I'll give that a bit of a press off camera, and this is how it looks so far. Super neat and tidy, love this. So now that that's done, I'm ready to close up my arms. So my fabric here is currently wrong sides together. I need them to be right sides together in order to sew them. So I'm just rolling up my cape onto the shoulder, pulling that facing out from underneath and laying it right sides together now with my armhole. Pinning and ready to stitch. and I'm stitching here at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, back stitching at the start, taking it super gentle here, trying to maintain that beautiful curve of the arm, and back stitching at the end. So off camera I've just trimmed down that seam in exactly the same way as I did before, and now that that's done, I'm ready to turn my dress right side out. So I'm just popping my hand between the facing and the outer fabric, grabbing the back of the dress and pulling the whole thing through the shoulder seam. And after a good press, this is how it looks. So now that my neckline and armholes are all closed up, I'm ready to close up my side seams. So I'm just putting the cape piece out of the way, pulling my facing away from the dress and lining up those side seams the whole way down. Pinning and ready to stitch. Back stitching to start at my 1 centimeter seam allowance the whole way down, and back stitching to finish. So that's how that looks. So I just need to tidy up that edge and give it a bit of a press, which I've went ahead and done off camera. And I've also just trimmed away the bulk between the facing and the side seam there, and just like before, that will just help the facing to lie nice and flat there. And while I was at the overlocker, I've just finished off the edges of my centre back seam and the hem, just to tidy them up. So now that that's done, I'm ready for my centre back seam. So just laying one back over the other, right sides together, pulling my facing up out of the way, lining up my edges the whole way down, and pinning. And I'm pinning here from the top of the slit to the bottom of my zip. I'll be stitching this piece with a normal stitch length, and then from the bottom of the zip to the neck I'll be using a longer stitch length. So starting at the top of the slit, back stitching, and then up to the bottom of my zip, back stitching again, adjusting my stitch length and stitching using that longer length right up to the neckline, back stitching to finish. So that's how that looks, and I just need to press that seam flat, so you can see I've done that off camera. And now that that's done, I'm ready to add my zip. So I'm using a standard concealed zip here. I'm just laying it right sides together with that press seam, and I'm going to hand tack that into place. So just using long running stitches here, lining up the center of the zip with that press seam, stitching through the zipper tape and the seam allowance in underneath. And I'll finish the rest of that off camera. This is how it looks. And now that that's done, I can remove those longer stitches that I sewed on the machine. So just using my seam ripper here, and again I'll finish that off camera. So now I can open my zip the whole way down, which will make it much easier to stitch on the machine. So using my standard zipper foot, starting at the top, back stitching, and taking it nice and gently here, trying to make sure that I'm stitching as close as I can to the zipper teeth without going through them. So just taking my time the whole way down. Finishing with a back stitch at the bottom. And of course I do exactly the same to the other side. So that's how one side looks. So I just need to remove those tacking stitches. And once both sides are done, this is how it looks. So super neat and tidy. I'm very pleased with this. So it just needs a bit of a press before I can move on to the next step, which is covering up the zipper tape with a little piece of lining fabric. So I've just cut myself a rectangle of the lining fabric. It's a little bit longer than the zip and it's a couple of inches wide. And I'm just going to attach that to that centre back seam on one side. I seen this on a dress in a shop recently and I thought I would give it a go myself. So I've just pinned that in place and I'm stitching here using a little bit of a longer stitch length again. I still have my zipper foot on my machine. I'm stitching at about half of my seam allowance, back stitching at the start and the end, and this is just going to give a really soft and smooth barrier between the zipper tape and my skin at the back. So it's just going to make it nice and comfortable and also nice and neat. And this is how it looks. So I'm really pleased with how this has turned out. So now that that's done, I'm ready to attach my facing at that centre back seam. So folding that little bit of lining fabric towards the dress, laying my facing fabric over the top, lining it up with that centre back seam and pinning and ready to stitch. And I'm stitching here again at about half of my seam allowance, back stitching at the start and the end, and of course I do exactly the same on the other side. So that's how that looks, and I just need to turn it through right side out and give it a bit of a press, which I've went ahead and done off camera, and this is how it looks, nice and neat and tidy. And from the inside, I am so pleased with how this has turned out. I will definitely use this finish again. So now I only have a couple more things to do before this dress is finished, one of which is to stitch down the facing at that underarm seam. And I'm stitching in the ditch, and all that means is my needle is piercing the fabric right in that seam, back stitching at the start and the end. So that's how that looks. So that's just going to hold that facing in place and stop it rolling to the outside. So happy with that. So the very last thing I have to do is to finish my hems. So off camera I've mitered those corners and pressed my hems in place. And for this dress I've chosen to hand stitch the hems. So I'm using a silk thread here and a super fine needle. And I'm just running a herringbone stitch right the whole way around the hem, up the slit at the back and back down the other side. So starting at one of the slits, anchoring my thread, picking up a little bit of the fabric at the bottom of the dress, and then at a diagonal down to the hem, picking up a little bit of fabric from there, back up to the dress, little bit of fabric, at a diagonal, down to the hem, picking up a bit of the fabric. And I'll repeat that, as I say, the whole way around and up the slit. And once it's done and had a nice press, this is how it looks. Nice and neat and tidy. Love this. And with that, this little dress is complete. So I have that cape all joined at the neckline, fully lined. I got those waist darts and bust darts, that lovely hem at the bottom, and at the back, that super nice slit, those waist darts, my zip all nicely in place, with that little bit of barrier fabric there, my facing all in place, and this is what it looks like on. So I'm super pleased with how this has turned out. I love the placement of the fabric. I love the length of the skirt and that split in the back. I love the cape. It's super comfortable, feels really cozy. I love that little bit of fabric protecting my skin at the centre back seam. It feels so nice against the skin. And if you've been following my Insta stories, you would have seen the inspiration for this. and you might have seen another version. If not, it should be coming soon. But suffice to say, I absolutely love how this has turned out.
So I really hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope you found it useful. If you did, give it a thumbs up. If you've not yet subscribed, please do, and I shall see you guys in my next one. Until then, I hope you have a fantastic week. Bye, folks!